Hi, y'all. Thanks for joining. We'll get started here right at 2 o'clock. All right, hi. I have 2 o'clock on my time, so I wanted to say good afternoon and thank y'all for joining us for our second to last part of our virtual training series with our legislative contact team members. I see a lot of repeat attendance here in the audience, and I just want to say thank y'all for continuing to join us virtually. And I hope that you are finding this series to be beneficial. For those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. Let's do a quick recap for the new attendees and for those of us returning on what we've learned so far. Congressional Management Foundation has shared with us why building relationships with legislators and their staff is important, how we can move the needle with our elected officials by sharing our stories and giving us effective strategies we can use to engage with our elected officials. Today, we'll be exploring how to build relationships back home. And we've been hosting these trainings since August, so I hope that by now you are no stranger to the Congressional Management Foundation and the great work that they do to strengthen the bridge and understanding between elected officials and the constituents that they serve. Joining us again today is Brad Fitch, President and CEO of Congressional Management Foundation. Brad has spent 25 years in Washington as a journalist, congressional aide, college instructor, internet entrepreneur, writer, researcher. Brad has done it all, and for those of you joining us, you know that. Also joining us is Seth Turner. He is the Director of Citizens Engagement with Congressional Management Foundation. Seth has served in national nonprofit organizations as public policy and advocacy professional and currently directs advocacy and training initiatives for CMF, including their Partnership for a More Perfect Union program. Together, Brad and Seth have decades of experience in communications, public policy, citizens engagement, and they provide great and useful insight to many organizations across the nation, including NAR. As a reminder to y'all, if you have any questions throughout the session, please type them in the Q&A box at any time, and then Brad and Seth and I will do our best to answer them at the end of the presentation. Brad, Seth, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Joanna. Once again, we're delighted to be back in Texas virtually and delivering this content to you. And I'm going to go ahead and start sharing our presentation here today while keeping our video going. Today's topic is Stay-cation Advocacy, how to win in Washington and Austin from your own backyard. This is actually one of our most popular programs because it offers advocates real practical advice on how to set up events and participate with lawmakers back home, which we know from our research and we'll show you is one of, if not the most valuable tool in a citizen advocate's toolkit. Members of Congress and state legislators report to us consistently that when they are able to literally physically walk through or now virtually walk through a business or walk with a group of people on their terrain in their environment, they have a much more robust and clear understanding of what the policy implications are for the decisions they made. Now, of course, many of the tips and advice we're going to be offering here today regarding in-person events are not going to be possible until we're able to change the situation with regard to coronavirus and a vaccine. Having said that, we're going to kind of give you a bit of a hybrid view of things because we have talked and worked with groups that are doing virtual site visits. Seth Turner has actually done some specific research on that with some other associations and nonprofits that are doing the virtual site visits with members, and he'll touch on that during today's program. And we'll talk through some of the other good rules that we can follow for doing events with members of Congress. Finally, many of you know our name is the Congressional Management Foundation, and our research is largely based on surveys of congressional staff. But this program in particular really has no differentials between state and federal lawmakers. The rules, the procedures, the processes that you would go through to set up an event for a state senator versus a US member of the House of Representatives isn't different at all. You follow the same protocols, the same procedures. It might be in some cases easier, maybe not, to get a member of your state legislature to come to visit you and your colleagues or your customers or some of your other clients, but the principles and the practices are the same. I'm going to skip over. You guys have all seen our legal stuff slide saying that this is our intellectual property. And I'm going to jump right into the program and talk a little bit about where our advice and guidance comes from. As I said, we do many surveys of congressional staff on a regular basis. And one of our best questions that we got some great data from is this one right here. How important are each of these for understanding constituent views and opinions? We started asking this question in 2005. We keep getting the same data back every time we ask it every 5 years. And this is a list of different ways that members of Congress consume information to understand constituent views and opinions. And as you can see here, telephone town hall meetings, this is the top list. We gave them about 20 things. So this is the top 6 or 7. 74% said telephone town hall meetings, which we talked about last week. 82% in-person town halls. Some members are still doing office hours in the district or state. We've seen before, personalizing messages is a huge factor to influencing elected lawmakers. Of course, meetings between the members and the constituents is going to be very high. Attending events in the district or state, also very high. Communications from a rep's district or state-based group. That's everyone who can hear my voice. If you're interacting with a lawmaker, if you're meeting with a lawmaker, they're going to consider you a representative for other real estate agents. And meetings between staff and constituents. Take a look at this list and look at how many of these activities are completely state-based or at least driven from the states. And that's the important message for today's program. To say it in a different way from a chief of staff who we interviewed for this program, constituents should be reminded that they can meet with the member in the district office at any time. Often in DC, meetings get disrupted more than we'd like by votes, etc. Meetings can go awry and they wind up only being able to meet with staff. So that's a big reminder that you have a lot more flexibility than just the DC fly-in or the Austin fly-in, where you can interact with lawmakers in a variety of other areas. And as you've seen from the previous programs, those groups and individuals, those citizen advocates that engage in that type of activity, that's just more rare than others, are going to differentiate yourself. You're going to be, frankly, more memorable to the lawmaker. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to be doing here today. So first, we're going to talk about why Stay-cation advocacy works. And then Seth is going to walk you through the Stay-cation guidebook, a little bit more of a guide on how and what you can do to enhance your abilities and your influence back home. We'll talk a little bit about and give you the practical elements of scheduling a Stay-cation advocacy event. And we're going to put extra emphasis on doing it in a pandemic because some of the procedures have changed for congressional offices, and we very much want to make you aware of that. And of course, as always, as Joanna said, please ask questions along the way. We'll be happy to handle them at the end of today's program so that you get a good, robust experience here as part of this series of 4 training programs we're doing for the Texas realtors. Okay, why Stay-cation advocacy? Well, one of the things that people get a little off is they don't realize how much time lawmakers and staffers are back home. They think that everything is in Washington and everything is DC based, but it's not. In 2010, the new Speaker of the House of Representatives, then John Boehner, and when he took over in 2011, changed the congressional calendar and in fact added a lot more recesses and frankly a lot more certitude in the calendar. This just shows you how things have changed, that in 2010 there were 5 recesses during the year and it was unclear when Congress might recess at the end of any given week. Coming up next year under Majority Leader Hoyer's schedule, there'll be 11, but that doesn't count the number of Fridays and Mondays that they're also going off. Now, there's a number of people who have complained to Congress that they're not doing their job and they should spend more time in Washington. I'm putting that aside for another debate, another day. But the point is, they are back home a lot. And there's a lot of opportunities for you to build relationships and connect with them back in the district or state. One scheduler said this, he or she said, constituent groups should always allow the congressional office to determine the time they will meet with the member instead of dictating the best time frame for them. So this scheduler is saying that flexibility back home is going to give you a little bit more of a leg up to be with that member and build a member of Congress. Okay, let me go on to the next question because this one is one of those that often surprises me. So this was a survey question we did of senior congressional staff, including schedulers and chiefs of staff. And we asked this question like this: the member of Congress prefers to have meetings with constituent groups where, and what we found, no preference at all was the big winner. 16% said the district, only 13% said DC. So nearly 9 out of 10 staffers are saying it really doesn't matter. And if you have a choice, the district is probably a winner. And this is something that I think everybody should keep in mind as you think about where you're going to have this interaction with the lawmaker, whether it's in the state or federal capital or back in their district. One of the things you know if you've been part of a DC fly-in is that things are often very hectic when you're meeting with a member of Congress in their Washington office. The TVs are always on. They have this old-fashioned bell system that was invented 100 years ago to alert members of Congress when they're going to have votes for some reason that is beyond explanation. The damn thing keeps going off and the buzzers keep going on, and all it does is just irritate people. But you know, tradition's tradition, and I kind of get that. So it's a lot more hectic, but when you're back home, it's a lot better. And a lot more higher quality interaction. They're longer. You can include more people, whether it's at the facility and your business or it's at the member of Congress's office. One staffer said it like this: nothing replaces face-to-face interacting with staff. It matters less where the meeting is with state staff or DC staff, and more important that we can sit down and talk with someone. The point of this particular slide is staff are important too. And if you remember in the last presentation that we gave you on the Citizen Advocates Toolkit, one of the pieces of advice congressional staff gave us through our survey research is building a relationship with the state-based staff, specifically the district director, is a really important strategy for citizen advocates to employ. Okay, the next question we wanted to ask is to show you that being in session isn't everything. When is the best time for a constituent to meet with you on a policy-related matter? And what we found, interestingly, from a staff perspective, it's when Congress is not in session. The point is that there's a lot of activity and interest always when the legislature's in session, and that's important, especially in Texas, when you're meeting, you know, for 3 or 4 months, usually every 2 years. I mean, that's a big deal. But you shouldn't ignore that time out of session to build relationships, to connect with them. It gives you an opportunity to interact with lawmakers and staff in a much more casual and frankly substantive way. Now, the next slide I want to share you is going to be a real big of a head scratcher, but it's going to demonstrate how much time members of Congress are spending with the constituents. There's this belief out there that members of Congress are spending all their time raising money. They're not meeting with constituents. They're not doing their job. Well, we did a survey of members of the House of Representatives a few years ago. These are actual members of the House that gave us their percentage of time of what they spend their time on. And let me just show you what it is, because it's really illustrative on how much time is available for them in the district to meet with you. When they ask them how much time they spend when they're in Washington, D.C., the number one answer, plurality's 35%, said legislation and policy. But look, 17% is still spent on constituent services as they break up the rest of their time. But when they're back home, the number one activity at 32% of their time is spent with constituent services. They're looking for opportunities to interact with you, and they're looking for high quality opportunities to interact with you, meaning visits to facilities, whether that's, you know, hospitals or schools, or in your cases, properties, or it could be businesses. So they're looking for those really high quality opportunities to interact with their constituents, and especially constituents that are affiliated with a group that is frankly as important to the economy as the real estate industry. So these are clearly, they have the time to do it. Finally, I just want to show you in this last series is how much time they spend going back and forth with the district. Back in the 1960s and 70s, it was very common for a member of Congress to move their family to Washington, D.C., get a home in suburban Arlington or something like that, and then, spend time back in the district. That was when air travel was more difficult and expensive. Well, starting around the 80s and 90s, that shifted. And members of Congress decided to keep their families back home. They don't want to be accused of going Washington, which means they're coming back to their districts a lot. In the same survey we did of members of the House of Representatives, 8 out of 10, 78%, said they go back home more than 40 weekends a year. Now, of course, it's a little different for the members from Alaska and Hawaii, but for people from Texas, they're going to be going back and forth. So they spend a lot of time in the district or state. What this means is members are looking to interact with you in a way that's going to give them information to help them do their job. What they want to know is, what do you want me to take? Why do constituents want me to do that? What are the current and or potential local impacts? And what are constituents' personal stories or connections to the policy? A staycation advocacy strategy in which you're demonstrating and answering all these questions with the member in a local setting is, we know from our research, one of the most effective strategies that you can engage in. So that's the context and gives you sort of the why staycation advocacy. Seth is going to walk you through the staycation advocacy guidebook to give you some strategies to help build on this data. Seth?
Thanks, Brad. As I was kind of reviewing this program earlier today, I realized that we're missing one really important piece of guidance about a staycation advocacy. And I'm kind of reminded about a story or something I did when I was in college. So when I was in college, I drove across the country 5 times from Washington, D.C. I drove from Washington, D.C. back home to California. And one of these trips, I don't know what I was thinking, but I decided not to call home at all. And my parents did not hear from me until I walked in the front door of their house. And I thought that this would be kind of a fun surprise or something like that, coming home thing. And instead, they were really ticked off at me, and understandably so. And but it just, the reason I'm saying that story is whether or not you're going to do when you do policy or advocacy visits in Washington, but when you do them at home, the national office or the state office, the groups that are kind of coordinating all this, the advocacy professionals that are coordinating the advocacy, if they don't know that you engaged with a policymaker, then they're really kind of flying blind, and they don't have a clue about what you're doing, and then they can't coordinate. It makes their job a lot more difficult. So make sure that you always kind of let the national office or the state office, whoever is coordinating your advocacy efforts, know about what it is that you're up to. Okay, let's get going with some research here. And so one of the things that we also wanted to kind of figure out is, what are some of the important ways that groups can engage with members in the district in order to influence legislation and influence members. So we asked this survey question here.
Seth, if I may interject here for a second, because I want to make sure people understand this particular set of data they're getting. This survey set is from state and district directors. So these are specifically the people who are back home that are helping the member understand district events and activities. So this is a specific subset of congressional staff that are state-based, and they're the most senior people in the congressional office. So I just wanted to put that context for this data they're about to share with them.
Thanks, Brad, because I was about to neglect to do that. So I'm glad you chimed in with that really important detail. So we asked district directors and state directors this question here that goes like this: when your member is trying to develop new ideas for issues in legislation, how important are the following activities? And so we listed a number of them, and things like town hall meetings, 52%, community office hours, 62%, and task forces at 82%. But then you start kind of moving up the ladder here. You think site visits, 85%, meetings with interest groups, representatives. That one comes in at 89%, meetings with constituents, 95%, and 100% said that meetings with VIPs or community leaders. When you see those top 4 especially those top 4 things you see, these are all things, frankly, everything on this chart it shows you a list of activities that you can do. You don't have to be in Washington in order to do these things. In fact, some of these things you have to do at home. But these are all activities that you can do when you're home in the district. And, I think about when I was at Goodwill, and I used to get people that would say, we can't be involved in advocacy because we can't come to your Washington fly-in event. I wish I'd, thought to use this chart, because I could have shown them, hey, there are all sorts of things that you can do right there in your own backyard. Another question, a survey question that we asked went like this: when your member is trying to understand interest groups' views and pending issues in legislation, how important are the following activities? And again, here's what you see is a number of things where these are all activities that can be done in the district or state. Office hours, you see some of the same activities. Also important, not just for giving members of Congress new ideas for legislation, but also for helping them understand your views and your group's views. So this is where we got a lot of the data. This is the data that backs up a lot of the advocacy strategies that we're going to talk to you about moving forward in the program as we kind of go through the Stay-cation guidebook. So you're planning your Stay-cation advocacy. So one quote that we got when we did that from an open-ended question that we got was from the House District Director. I think it really illustrates an important point. It goes like this: if they're friendly, and even if we don't agree, most likely I will approve a meeting with the congressman. Look there at that, like those 3 words, I will approve, from the House. This is a House District Director. That's the person who is approving, where the meeting. You notice who's not mentioned in there, as somebody who's getting to have much of a say, the member of Congress themselves. So Brad, I know that you worked on the Hill, and you've talked about before about, when you're thinking through about what's the member's schedule when they get back home, it's typically, the scheduler, maybe the chief of staff and the district director that are sitting there and kind of hammering out the member's schedule when they're in the district. The member usually just gets handed their schedule. Maybe they complain a little bit, but they really don't have nearly as much say in what they're going to be doing when they're in Washington, when they're at home in the district, as you might think.
Actually, my bosses complained a lot about that. Not a little bit. They was one of the biggest frustrating parts about being a member of Congress is the total lack of control over your schedule, and it drives families and members crazy. And you described it well. When I was a communications director for a United States senator, and a job I had for 5 years, and we were going to plan a event or a series of events, maybe during a recess period. We're coming up, let's say, with the president's recess period. We knew we were going to have 5 days back home. About 2 months out, we'd get a conference call together with the district director, state directors, maybe regional director, and the schedulers, and myself, and I'm the communications director, and we plan backwards. We say, okay, what photo do we want? What's the theme do we want to hit? Do we want to talk about budgets? Do we want to talk about juvenile crime? Do we want to talk about welfare reform? Kind of tells you what era of time I was working in. And then we plan accordingly, and we would map out this entire schedule. The important point here from a strategy standpoint, what this means for you is, for you as a very important member of the community in a very important industry, if you build that relationship with the district director, or in bigger states, for senators, the regional director, it means your voice is going to be in their head when they're planning that out. If you've got a request in that's pending, and let's say it's very flexible, sometime during the August recess period or sometimes during the July 4th recess period, and we'll talk about when to make those requests, then you're going to be in the room. You're going to literally be considered as a candidate for a meeting or a site visit when that congressional office is doing that planning process. And I can't emphasize enough the number of times when I was setting up these meetings, and I'm back in DC and I'm the communications director, and we'd start the meeting and the district director would just give me a list of the groups that we had to hit, because they had reached out to him or her and it said, can we meet with the legislator? And that smart district or state director or regional director had compiled a list. And folks, you can make that call and you can be on that list, or don't make that call and you won't be on the list. I mean, that's literally as Machiavellian as I can make it. You really have to not be in their face, but just make the request ahead of time and make sure you've got some specifics about what you have in mind. And then when that team of people, that senior staff of that congressional office or even that state legislator office is planning something, you're going to be on the list. And I think that's an important part. So one component doesn't have to be a site visit. You may not need to get them to come to a particular facility, but one element of a staycation advocacy is just having in-state meetings, just having a meeting in the district or state. And Seth and I are going to walk you through the top 10 tips when meetings with members of Congress, which I don't think we share for you. And while this is somewhat true for DC, this is very, very true for what's going on back in the district or state. So I'm going to give you the first 5. Seth is going to give you the next 5. So here are the top 10 tips when you're meeting with a member of Congress back home to keep in mind. Number 1, be clear on the goal. This is especially true. Sorry if you just heard my hound dog barking in the background. Welcome to, life in Zoom. Be clear on the goal. Make sure you understand and have specific instructions and guidance from your state-based or your national-based lobbyists and government relations professionals on what you're having this meeting for. Know who you're talking to. For those of you who've been in our previous programs, and one of the things we tipped you off to in doing a relationship profile or a legislator profile is do a little research on that lawmaker. Always respect the staff at the state and federal level. They are the gatekeepers. They have knowledge, information, and access to a politician. That is really important for you. Know your issue. You don't want to be just reading off a set of talking points from the national or state office. And if you can, connect the issue to the member's district or state in a way that is meaningful for them. If they happen to be in a floodplain area and you're talking about flood insurance, map it out for them. Unless they're a former real estate agent, I doubt they're going to be an expert on flood insurance. They could be on a relevant committee, but most members and state legislators don't have that kind of, frankly, bandwidth and brain power to be experts on everything. So they're counting on you to draw that connection between the issue and the district or state. Seth, you can take it from here.
Sure. Maybe you can go deal with the dog, right?
Yep.
So the next tip is to keep it short. Your meetings are typically a meeting is maybe 15 minutes. If you're up in a half an hour range, you're really getting a lot of extra time there. Typically the meetings are about 15 to 20 minutes. So you don't have a lot of time to spend kind of doing the banter and all that kind of stuff. You want to just kind of get in there, maybe a little bit of chit chat, and then get started with the meeting. A lot of people feel just really awkward about, having a meeting like that, especially one of the best things to do. I used to do all the time was just start out with what you're there to ask them about. Members of Congress, their staff, they're really used to meetings kind of going in this direction. It may feel a little awkward for people who are more used to having meetings that last a little bit longer, but their schedules are pretty tight. And so, they need you to they need to keep their meetings pretty tight. So that means you want to deliver the message in the first 5 minutes, right? You don't want to beat around the bush and spend all this time kind of doing the banter, and then you don't have time to actually have a substantive conversation with the people that you're there to meet. You want to deliver that message in the first 5 minutes. And speaking of message, you never want to go off message. If you tell a staff person that you want to meet with them about flood insurance, you don't want to turn around and then talk to them about something completely different. I will never forget when I was working at Catholic Charities, and we were involved in a flying event, and somebody went into their office and they were supposed to go in there and talk about housing. And they decided instead to have a debate with the staff person about the member's position on abortion. And after a while, the staff person tried to redirect the meeting back to the topic, but ended up the staff person just shut their notebook and said, "This meeting's over," and they walked out of the room. Also, if you switch up topics, you may not even be talking to the person who has that issue on their portfolio. So you want to stick to the message. Next is the less paper, the better. And when we asked about sort of how long should your papers be, you're looking at about 1 to 2 pages, no more than that. Anything really much longer than that kind of winds up in the recycling bin. I really used to like to use reports. I actually wrote a couple for Goodwill, and they were pretty long, meaty reports, and we would include those in those little kind of glossy folders and stuff. Well, unfortunately, I've learned after the fact that, I learned later down the road that they aren't looking at those. What my advice is, and something I kind of learned after I kind of figured this out, was if you like using longer kind of media reports, I like to use them as a prop. I kind of go in there with my copy of the report. It's got coffee stains on it and, notes in the margins and highlighter. You get the idea. It's the kind of really well-loved report that you have, but nobody else would want that copy of it. And you just kind of reference it and show it like a prop. And you probably are going to get the question of, oh, that's really interesting. Do you think you could send me that in an attachment or a link later on? And also a little tip is you want to send, especially if you're doing virtual advocacy, you want to send any materials in advance, because that gives staff the amount of time to kind of read through the one pagers and kind of prepare for the meeting. And it basically allows you to kind of start your meeting a little bit more forward in the conversation, because you don't have to spend that first 5 minutes kind of providing remedial education that they could have read in advance of the meeting. And then lastly, you want to make sure that you follow up immediately. We talk a little bit more about follow-up later, but our research shows that that most citizen advocates really fall down on the job when it comes to doing follow-up. And you think about it, if you don't do good follow-up, if you don't send a follow-up email after a meeting, it kind of sends a message that you didn't really mean to send, which is, I came into this meeting and I asked you for a meeting, you gave it to me, and I wasted your time on something that really isn't a big priority to me. And that's definitely not the message that you want to lead. So let's talk a little bit about scheduling now. And, when you do a meeting request, we get this question quite a bit. It's like, well, how long should I wait after I've submitted a request before I follow up on that? So we asked schedulers this question here. Generally, how quickly does your office take to respond to a request for a meeting with the member? And what we found is that if you haven't heard back in 1 to 2 weeks, you are well within your right to be able to just call up the scheduler and just make sure that something didn't fall through the cracks. Much earlier than that, it says you're asking for a fairly tight turnaround. But after 2 weeks, if you haven't heard anything, it's completely fine for you to follow up to make sure that request is being processed. So let's talk a little bit about.
Seth, before we go on, I just want to also add another subtle note that I know chiefs of staff and scheduler have told me as well over the years. Is Seth said it, you can follow up in 1 to 2 weeks. And it's okay to follow up a second time, especially if you're working with freshman offices. Freshman offices are not going to have their scheduling operation up and running for at least about 2 months. At least, well, it'll be up. It won't be running. It won't be running effectively, I assure you. And so if you're trying to build a relationship with a freshman office, it's okay to do the second follow-up. If you don't get a response, excuse me, if you don't get a response to an official request through their typical system, which we're going to talk about in a minute, it's okay to go to a district office staffer and raise a question. I can tell you in no uncertain terms, when I was a chief of staff, if my district director came to me, and we did have a problem with one of our schedulers who we ended up letting go, and came to me and said, you know what, I ran into so-and-so at the dry cleaner, and she's put in 2 requests for meetings and she hasn't heard anything back. Oh my gosh. If my boss heard that, her head would have exploded. I mean, that is the last thing the lawmakers want to hear. So it is okay to do follow-ups. You're actually doing the lawmaker a bit of a favor when they do that. Seth, back to you.
Thanks, Brad. So, there's besides meetings, there are some other really effective things that you can do with a member of Congress. And so we also asked this question of district directors, which went like this: when your member is trying to be visible throughout the district, how important are the following activities? Now, we listed quite a few. I'm just going to show you one, though. Important site visits. 95% of the district directors that answered this question said that that's a really important activity for members for understanding, for trying to be visible in the district. And only 4% said, I'm trying to figure out who these 4% were who would answer that question, because site visits are just such a great way for you to really help them to understand your walk a mile in your shoes, right? They get to kind of go to a facility and they kind of get to see it, feel it, touch it, meet the people that you work with. That's a really, really a great way to just help a member kind of get into a member of Congress's head and help them understand, the work that you do. also, we kind of wanted to think, I used to get this question quite a bit when I was at Goodwill as their advocacy, their senior advocacy and policy director, which is, how long should we expect to kind of plan to have a site visit? And so we asked this question: when your member attends a site visit in the district, whether they're touring a factory or visiting a child care center, et cetera, how long should the visit ideally take? And what we found is pretty much you need to be shooting for about 1 hour. Anything much longer than that is a little gravy. You might get up to something about 2 hours, but really don't expect anything any longer than that. Also, I used to get this question of, where people wanted to show the member one particular facility, but then they also wanted to show them something else that was, like clear across town. And that's a pretty big no. You don't want to do that because, again, you don't have a whole lot of time. And so the last thing that you want to do is, spend time, have that member spending their time being transported from one thing to the next. So you need to be a little bit creative about, if you have something that's somewhere else, you don't want to, you want to get creative about how it is that you might be able to illustrate that on site. Again, also, a lot of people have thought that site visits are, kind of put on ice now because of COVID. And I'm going to kind of punch a hole in that and suggest, no, that's not necessarily the case. I think a lot of creative advocates, frankly, are the ones that ought to be doing site visits. I mean, you think about it, there's technology right there in your home. You got a PC or a phone or some sort of mobile device. They all have cameras on them. These are all things that can be utilized, just common technology in your home that can be utilized to kind of create a virtual site visit. You can use kind of virtual backgrounds if you need to, and sort of stand off to the side of something and almost like show something like a weatherman if you wanted to kind of show different parts of a home or something like that.
Well, Seth, this might be a good point to interject the work that you did with the Retail Federation.
Sure.
That you were working with, and this was about 2-3 months ago, I think, and you'll have to correct me because you were the one taking the lead on this particular sub project. But talk a little bit about what they did and what their virtual site visit looked like.
Right. So the National Federation of
National Retail Federation.
National Retail Federation. They did site visits where they did a virtual site visit effort, and they scheduled these meetings. They would have typically about, just maybe 4 or 5 individuals that would sort of be involved in the site visit. They get the member of Congress on. Sometimes they'd also get staff people from the Washington office that could participate. You think about that. I can't remember how many times I would ask the question when I was lobbying, hey, do you ever get back to the district? And it was almost always, I've never been, I'm not from the district and I don't get to go there ever or very often. And you think about that from a Washington, D.C. staff perspective, that means that they really don't totally understand the district. And so doing a virtual site visit and allowing them to participate is something that's a real kind of bonus, frankly. But what the National Retail Federation did is they had site visits were in a store, and they would kind of stage things a little bit. So they would have the person talk, maybe they'd kind of have a little bit of an initial meeting about sort of policy, but then they would kind of do a showcase where I saw one video where the person was simply just walking around kind of backwards with her phone on in selfie mode, and she was kind of describing the store and showing different, the shelves. It was a toy store where they were showing the different shelves, and a lot of the inventory was pretty low, so a lot of empty shelves. Introduced the member to different staff people. Actually, there was this one really great moment because they had talked about postal reform, and the postman actually just ended up walking into the store at the time. And so there was this really great kind of moment where hey, there's the postman there. And they were talking, they were able to kind of reference, hey, we were just talking about postal reform. So there are a lot of different things that you can do. You kind of have to think through the technology piece a little bit. And we do a whole program on how to do a virtual site visit and how to, kind of things that you want to do's and don'ts for using the technology that I won't go into now. But it's just a really, can be a very effective tool. And I think, frankly, it's going to be one that's here to stay because, we issued a report a few months ago about that, where the real point of the report is that this technology has been adopted a little bit, and that the pandemic has actually accelerated the adoption of a lot of this technology, right? I mean, you think about, back in February, how many people were using Zoom that much? Now everybody is, with I think the exception of my mother, who it's never going to happen, folks. I love my mom to death, but she's just not going to get on that wagon. But you think about that, all this technology has been adopted, and what our research has shown is that it's here to stay. The members of Congress have gotten a lot more comfortable with it. Their staff has gotten more comfortable with it. They're having substantive conversations through it. And so it kind of changes things where you may not necessarily have to wait for the recess or the member to be back home in the district. If you have something really important that you need to show them and it's really relevant at that time, you might be able to schedule a virtual site visit well off into the future. Okay, let's talk a little bit about scheduling your staycation advocacy. So we got these quotes from district directors here. One of them goes like this: you want to focus on the big picture, but don't forget the tiny details. It's really important to when you're engaging with the scheduler that you want to kind of give the schedulers an understanding of what the whole kind of the high level understanding of what this meeting or site visit is about, but you also want to make sure that you're prepared to provide all the details that they will likely ask you for. Another quote went like this: I've become very wary of groups that won't specify how many people will attend a meeting. Again, so providing all the details in advance is a really important thing. And most schedulers, if they don't get all the details that you're looking they need, it's gonna slow everything down, and they're not going to. You may not end up getting the meeting scheduled or the site visit scheduled at all if you're not thorough with providing all that detail.
And let me go into a little detail there, Seth, because this is a really important point. In providing complete details to a scheduler is an essential part of the process, because it's a real warning flag if you go to a congressional or state office and state legislator and say, yeah, my group wants a meeting, but I'm not going to tell you who will be there. It's very unlikely that's going to happen. So make sure you have your cast of characters lined up in advance. So that's the who. Let's talk about the when, because what type of event you're doing and when you reach out to the office is actually a nuanced answer. The Congressional Management Foundation did a survey of House and Senate schedulers a few years ago, the first survey of its kind, to get some of the details of both state visits and DC visits. And this is what we found about in-state activities and timing, because it does make a bit of a difference on when you make the request. We put the question to the schedulers this way: for each of the following activities, how many weeks in advance should the request be made for the member to personally participate? So we wanted to know how far in advance they wanted it. And this is what we found that more than 5 to 6 weeks out, if you're doing something bigger, like a town hall style meeting, and even a virtual town hall style meeting, if you're going to try to put together a number of people in, let's say, a Facebook town hall, which we talked about last week, or a telephone town hall, give the member's office a little bit more advance notice. That's a bigger deal. That's something that you want to coordinate with them well in advance. As we've talked about, 3 to 4 weeks, just outside 4 weeks, is the sweet spot. So right about now, if you're thinking about obviously something for next year, that's going to be a little trickier. But if you want to get the member to attend, let's say, or interact with the lawmaker during the president's recess period, which happens in February, it's a good idea to probably get that request in maybe the first week of January. If you're looking for something farther out, which may be advisable, that's something only your state and federal lobbyists will be able to counsel. Again, there'll be times available that the member can do that virtually, and some of the rules are a little off on where it happens, but the when it happened hasn't changed. That's still this is pretty much the way things work, is you really want to go about 4 weeks out. And going back to when I said I was a communications director for a US Senator, that was always the magical moment. Once it hit 4 weeks, we had to start planning. 3 weeks is a little tight. I mean, you can get it and you make it happen, but I'd counsel much more going the 4 weeks out. And of course, there are other things that can happen, like a press conference or something like that you can't anticipate. But that's unusual. That's a little different, but maybe it is. I mean, you might be in a situation, let's say there's been a hurricane and you want to highlight the importance of flood insurance and the impact it's having on the members' constituents and your clients. That's okay to do that very quickly. But in general, the general rule of thumb is about 3 to 4 weeks out. One scheduler said it like this: I can't ask my boss if he wants to take this particular meeting until I have all the information. If I don't get the information in time, it won't go to the congressman. So that's pretty much in a nutshell exactly where you're at, is just you have to basically recognize that this is, a very complicated operation in some respects, and that members of Congress and their staffs have set up systems to ensure that they're not put in situations. I can tell you as a staffer, the last thing I wanted to hear is my boss coming back from an event and saying to me, I didn't know they were going to. And there was a reprimand at the end of that sentence, because they want to get that information. So if you give it to them far enough in advance, it can be helpful. So let's talk specifically about what's changed as a result of the pandemic, scheduling during a pandemic. Well, the first thing we would advise you to do is research the procedure for making a request. Every congressional office has a process, and some of them change the process during the pandemic and made it a little different. In some cases, for example, they have a section of their website. This is Senator Ted Cruz's section of his website. And you literally just click on that and it'll send an email to the scheduler. And it's as simple as that. Just next door in New Mexico, it's a little different, where they have a meeting request forms. Other people will have long voicemail messages. All you have to do to find out the procedure is first go to the website and see if it's there. And that's a place that you can go there. Or you can phone the district or state offices and say, I'd like to know the procedure for scheduling a meeting with the state senator, the congresswoman, what have you. And they will tell you. That is a magical phrase in a congressional office. They know exactly what you're asking for. And there are procedures in place for anyone other than freshmen that provide you with the guidance that you need to do that. So keep that in mind. So find out the scheduling procedure is the first thing to do during the pandemic, and they will tell you how they're doing it. They're all got systems. Secondly, I wanted to also touch on a couple of pet peeves that you want to avoid before we go finishing up the scheduling procedures. One, requesting meetings before you have all the attendees' names, hometowns, topics, we've already talked about that. Last minute requests, anything less than 1 to 2 weeks is not going to be encouraged. Nagging, that's never good. In marriages or in relationships with politicians, nagging is never good. So please keep that in mind. So back to some of the other tips for scheduling during a pandemic. Identify the best office and staffer for the meeting. If they're having a huge COVID outbreak in that particular district or state, right now, I really wouldn't be contacting anybody in an El Paso member's office asking for a meeting, given what's going on in El Paso right now. And I know what I'm talking about because it's making national news, what's going on in El Paso. So make sure maybe you want to talk to the DC office, or maybe you don't want to talk to that office at all until the pandemic dissipates somewhat in that particular area. Research the preferred method. If video, how do they want to talk to you during a pandemic? Do they prefer Zoom or MS Teams or WebEx? If you find the preferred method, make sure that you or your colleagues who will be interacting with that lawmaker via video is comfortable with that video. We've all experienced this. Some of these platforms like Zoom are really easy. You click on it, bada bing, bada boom, you're here. But others require a download that you have to do, like MS Teams or GoToWebinar. And if you don't do that, that could take 5 or 10 minutes. And if somebody clicks on the link for a 4 o'clock meeting with a politician, and you're not talking to the politician until 4:10, that's a problem. So you've got to take some extra steps during the pandemic. And please be flexible, especially in the first 6 months of the new administration. It's coming next year. It's going to be a roller coaster of legislation and of executive orders, and there's going to be a lot of activity. So please, be flexible, and they'll give you the time. I've said this a couple of times. You're not everybody else's industry, okay? The real estate industry and realtors are really important to every congressional district. You're certainly in the top 5 or 10 industries that they're going to care about. And, I love court reporters, but they're just not going to get the same kind of face time that you can, especially when they're really busy. So if you put that request in, it can make it happen. Now, the last case study before we go to Q&A, I want to share with you is a great case study that we learned about a few years ago. And it was a guy named Bob O'Hara. And I know about Bob because I actually ran into Bob at a conference and he shared his story. And I'm go ahead and share this with you right now and listen to a little bit on how Bob talks about how easy it is to build relationships with members of Congress and state legislators in the district or state.
At the time I decided I wanted to do something, I was trying to find a place where I could become an effective voice for this. And at that same moment, I ran across an organization called No Labels that was forming. This group was a group of Democrats, Republicans, and independents that said, look, we are approaching governing the wrong way. We need to come together to figure out how we're going to solve these problems and put our country before our party. This was a message that resonated with me. So I went to their very first meeting in Washington in 2011. And at that meeting, there was a speaker who gave a presentation about how you communicate with your representatives. Now, I was extremely skeptical that that's how it would work, especially from someone who had never been involved at all when it came to politics or government. But I said, I made this commitment, I'm going to give it a try. So I did what he said. Well, long story short, here I stand today. I've been to Washington now 8 times. I have met with the congressional staff of every single district here in Massachusetts. I have met with the senatorial staff of our last 4 senators. I have visited almost every congressional district office in our state. It can happen. You can become a voice.
One of the fun things I like to tell about this story is Bob came to me at a conference, as I said, and you heard him talking about a presenter that gave a presentation about how his voice could make a difference. And I was that presenter. It was the same data that you're seeing here today. And I think that really demonstrates the power of constituency and the power of really just making a decision that you're going to make a difference, that you're going to be a voice. And I loved running into Bob at this conference when he met me. He said, "Oh, I know you. I remember you from 7 years ago. You got me started on my quest." And I was like fascinated to hear this. And then of course, when I found this video, we were quite overjoyed. So that's kind of the general message. We're going to be wrapping up a little early today because Joanna's got some housekeeping items to go, but we have about 4 or 5 minutes for question and answer. So go ahead and turn on our videos, and Seth and I will make ourselves available here if you have any questions. And it can go outside of the Stay-cation advocacy presentation. If it's about something else, please feel free to go ahead and throw us a question.
Well, here, Brad, actually, here's a question that's, outside the scope a little bit. They want to know what your dog's name is.
Sophie. Was she really loud? Did you guys hear that?
No, it wasn't too bad.
Yeah. Puggle boxer mix.
So Rusty Deloach asks, he says, I missed points 3, 4, and 5. Would you please repeat them?
Sure. That was the number of the best practices for meetings. Number 3 is respect staff. Don't diss the help. Number 4 is know your issue, which is doing some research in advance. And number 5 is connecting your issue to the member's district or state. And I know the National Association provides you these amazing handouts that either you can produce or they produce. I don't know how the magic happens, but I've seen the magic in the result. And they are just without a doubt one of the best set of handouts I've ever seen for people meeting in the district or state to connect. But it doesn't have to be that complicated. Sometimes it's just telling people that constituents are affected.
Marcia Fisk had to step away and miss the tips for the first 5 tips, the ones that you delivered.
Well, I'll go ahead.
I think we're going to send the PDF, right?
Yeah, we'll send the slide deck to Joanna, and she'll send it off to everybody. So you at least have the details on this. And we also send, there's a publication, one of the rare free publications we have on meetings with members of Congress before, during, and after. It was based on just a variety of these surveys that we did with district directors, schedulers, and chiefs of staff. We did 3 separate surveys, and we asked a variety of different things, but a lot of it had to do with meetings. And that is really obviously the creme de la creme in terms of all the tools available to you. It's that in-person or video interaction with lawmakers that's going to really connect them to your issue and your state.
Yeah, Brad, you were talking about the realtors and how they have those great handouts about the district impact, and I can say from my own experience too. When I was at Goodwill, we actually had a guy who was he had like a master's degree in like geospatial science or something. He was a mapping guy, and he would develop these maps that would show, it was kind of an overlay of the members district, but then what's called the Goodwill service territory. So it showed the different stores, where the stores were, where the donation centers were, how many people were helped to get a job, revenue, all kinds of stuff in there. And when we would include those in those glossy folders, I'll tell you, they threw away my long reports, but they always pulled out the map right away, and it was the thing that they always referred to immediately. I can't even remember a meeting where that didn't happen because it was so great. But you don't actually have to have a master's in mapping in order to do stuff like that. I know you've heard a story about where somebody, showed up and you're like, wow, that was a really great map that you had. What programs you use? And they're like, Microsoft Word, right? So, but that impact it's just really important for them to be able to kind of understand how something really is impacting people in their district. The national numbers, we were on a panel. Remember we had a panel a while back and of congressional staff. And one of them just kind of blatantly said, like, I don't care about the national numbers. Don't tell me about the billions of people affected. I only care. It's a representative democracy. And I only care about the people in my district. And that's just the way it is.
And that frustrates some people. I know I've run into citizens all the time that say that, senators should represent everybody. And, we don't have a parliament, we have a republic, and it's just set up that way. But it also means that they are accountable to you and that they have to answer to you. And every member of Congress takes that responsibility very seriously. I know that you think, maybe you've watched too many House of Cards episodes, but, doing the stuff back in the district that we've talked about, getting out there, this is what these members live for. I'll give you one example, great Stay-cation advocacy story. Came a couple of years ago. We used to do a lot of work with the American Farm Bureau, and actually came to Texas and talked to the Texas Farm Bureau about 6-7 years ago, my first trip to San Antonio. And one of them came up to me afterwards and they gave me this wonderful story where they had been trying to kind of set up a meeting with the district director. Things didn't work out. And suddenly the farmer's phone rang, and it was like a Thursday night. And he said, look, I know this is really last minute, but we had a big cancellation tomorrow. Can you put together just 3 or 4 farmers at your farm to talk to the lawmaker? And this particular House member was chairman of an agriculture subcommittee that dealt with their commodities. So huge doesn't begin to say. So the lawmaker got out there, but wasn't greeted by 3 or 4, but the farmer had put together 20 of the farmers together. They're out in the field. He was supposed to stay there 30 minutes. He stayed there 2.5 hours, screwing up the entire schedule for the rest of the day, because this is what the lawmaker loved doing. He loved talking to people in their environment. And they actually, this is the fun part of their job. So when you think you might be imposing on the lawmaker to come visit, it's actually, you're doing them a favor. You're getting them out of the office. They're not having to raise money. They're interacting with people, and they're great out of doors. They don't have to wear a tie. They can get their picture taken not wearing a tie, which is something, as a press secretary, I got to tell you, I looked for all the time. I had a lot of photographs of my bosses in suits and tie or in women's professional wear talking in front of one of these. I didn't need any more photos like that. I need them out there talking to real people. With that, I know that Joanna has a couple of housekeeping matters she wants to wrap up here today's program. And I know we have one more program in this series. And so we look forward to that coming in January. But with that, I'll turn the microphone back over to our host.
Thank y'all both so much. I think the information that y'all have given us today and in the past few weeks have been really helpful. And I hope that y'all take this away and really use it as we look forward to the 87th legislative session. I know that it might look a little bit different than it has in the past. And while we won't likely have a really large Realtor Day at the Capitol with 3,000 of us at the Texas Capitol, we are working really hard. Texas Realtor staff and leadership are working on ways that we can still make an impact at the Capitol. And we'll be working on the best ways to have our legislative visits in this COVID environment. And it will likely highly rely on virtual meetings and the relationships that we are building between us and our legislators. That is why it's so important for us to have these trainings and have these built legislative contact teams, because these relationships are vital to our message. Please remember that if you are meeting with your legislator, keep staff involved. Let Texas Realtors, GA staff, and your local GAD know that you're meeting with them so that we can best assist you and give you the information that you need to relay our legislative priorities and information. Also, in prep for the legislative session, you can register for the Texas Realtors Legislative Preview webinar that will be taking place on December 17th at 10 a.m., where Jamie Lee, the Texas Realtors Director of Advocacy Communications, will be moderating a panel between 2021 Texas Realtors Chairman Marvin Jolly, 2021 Public Policy Oversight Committee Chairman Jeff Kahn, and Julia Parento, Texas Realtors Director of Public Advocacy. And I will be dropping that link to register in the chat right now. And another way to stay informed and prep for our legislative session is to subscribe to our Realtor Party mobile alerts. Being subscribed to the mobile alerts is a great way to ensure that you don't miss any important calls for action, and we use it sparingly. If you register by December 11th, you'll be entered for a chance to win a $500 gift card, and you can subscribe to that by texting TX Realtors at 30644. I am also dropping that in the chat. And also sign up for our Legislative Liaison newsletter so you don't miss out on any important news happening, and you can sign up for that by visiting texasrealestate.com/liaison. As a reminder, you'll be receiving a recording of today's session via email. I'll also include the presentation that Brad and Seth gave, and be on the lookout in the mail for your 100-year book that I referenced during the last training session if you are a key contact. And that's all we have time for today. Happy holidays. Know that our next session is January 6th, 2021 at 2 p.m. and I will send a registration link for that. Thank you guys so much for joining us.